Hayalperestlerin, risk alanların, denemekten korkmayanların cesaretinden doğduk. Bizi asla yarı yolda bırakmayan o sesin rehberliğiyle ilerlemeye ve öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Bunun için varız. Bu yüzden gece geç saatlere kadar lambalarımız sönmez. Elveda demek hem hüzün hem de gurur verir. Her şeyi sorgulayarak ve merakımızı besleyerek, dayanıklılığımızı test ederek, sınırlarımızı aşarak, ilerleyerek ve yeni ufuklar açarak yeni bir yol buluruz. Yeni icatlar çıkararak, kendi yolumuzu çizerek. Burası fikirlerin doğduğu ve yeni fikirleri doğurduğu, bizim de doğduğumuz, birlikte büyüdüğümüz ve yükseldiğimiz yer. Burası Yakın Doğu Üniversitesi.
Good morning and a very warm welcome to the second seminar of the Global Security Seminar Series organized by the Near East Institute. My name is Mustafa Çıraklı and I'm the director of the Institute. As some of you may know, we organize a number of events throughout the year to tackle issues that are of relevance to Cyprus, the Eastern Mediterranean region, but also issues that pertain to global affairs and global. We are delighted that in this academic term, we also launched a new seminar series that is on global security. And in this regard, we are delighted to be joined, of course, by a world-renowned scholar who's agreed kindly to talk to us on an especially topical issue, and that is, of course, cybersecurity, and more specifically dealing with that issue in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Now, of course, since the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia that began in February this year, we've seen cybersecurity emerging almost as a new frontline in that war, and with Ukrainian efforts trying to strengthen and defend their security, independence, and of course democracy by bolstering their cyber capabilities. Much of these efforts have been toward protecting public infrastructure, communication networks, and repelling the attacks and repairing systems following the. Also seen the European Union helping the Ukrainian government and the officials there to repel and mitigate these attacks, and are also supported by the US as well. But how often do these two actors, the EU and the US, talk to each other on these issues? What is the scope of their dialogue when it comes to cybersecurity? And more specifically, when we look at what's happening in Ukraine, are we seeing a new turning point in cybersecurity? Today, again, we are delighted to be joined by an expert who's been working on these issues for quite some time. That is Dr. Dimitrios Anagnostakis. Let me tell you a few words before I welcome Dimitrios. Dimitrios is a lecturer of security studies and international relations at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He joined Aberdeen in 2018, having previously worked at Liverpool Hope University. Dr. Anagnostakis holds a PhD from the University of Nottingham with a thesis on the relations between the EU and the US on internal security issues. And he continues to work on the EU transatlantic relations, cybersecurity, and international security. In this regard, he is the author of the EU-US Cooperation on Internal Security, I should say, Building a Transatlantic Regime, which was published by the Routledge in 2018. He's published a number of articles in the prestigious journals Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Terrorism and Political Violence, and the Journal of Cyber Policy. And more recently, Dimitrios Anagnostakis is also working on a new project on the EU-NATO cooperation on countering hybrid threats funded by the Carnegie Trust. Now, Dimitrios has kindly agreed to talk to us over the next 20 minutes, after which we will open the floor for your questions and discussion. So without any further ado, Dr. Dimitrios Anagnostakis, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Dr. Çıraklı, for the kind invitation. And many thanks also to the Near East Institute and the Near East University for inviting me here to talk about this very, very topical issue, as you mentioned. Finally, thank you for the introduction and the kind words. So let me start then with the structure of the talk. So yes, cybersecurity and the war in Ukraine. Cybersecurity is a very topical issue, and today I will first start with a couple of definitions. I will be very brief on that issue, on the issue of definitions. I will then very briefly talk about the academic literature. Then I will say a few things about cybersecurity and cyber war before the 2022 invasion. Then I will touch upon the issue of cyber capacity building, which was already mentioned by Dr. Çıraklı. So both the European Union and the United States had a presence in Ukraine before 2022. So it's important to have this in mind. Then I will talk about the cybersecurity elements of the recent 2022 war, and I will end the talk with a conclusion, some questions for reflection. Right, so the title of the talk is International Cybersecurity and the War in Ukraine. It's good to start with some definitions. What do we mean by cybersecurity? What does this concept mean? And as we all know, academics and social scientists love to define things. And indeed, when it comes to cybersecurity, we see hundreds of definitions, but we can broadly say that cybersecurity includes the following aspects or issues. First of all, the fight against cybercrime. Secondly, protecting critical infrastructure from disruption. For instance, water supply, electric supply, all these elements are using software. So protecting these supplies from cyber attacks is quite important. When we talk about cybersecurity, a third element is cyber capacity building. This is about states helping other states to build their cyber defenses. And European Union, UK, Russia, China, they are all active in this issue. We also have the element of cyber standards. So, for example, one topic is internet governance. So, who should control the internet? Should it be controlled by organizations such as the ICANN organization, or should states have a stronger role to play? In other words, different states and different alliances of states try to build some standards for this new area. And finally, we can talk about the cyber aspects of war and conflict. Right now, the cyber element is the fifth domain of war. We have land, sea, air, space, plus cyber. So states have started thinking about how to use this cyber aspect for both offensive and defensive operations. Another buzzword or buzz term during the last years is also this concept of hybrid threats and hybrid attacks. And one aspect in these hybrid threats or hybrid attacks is the cyber aspect. Finally, we have heard recently and again during the last years about disinformation and about manipulating information for political purposes. Again, some people would add this aspect of disinformation campaigns under the broader umbrella of cyber. Right, so cybersecurity and cyber war, there was an explosion in the literature in the 2000s. People were writing that cyber war is here. We should prepare for the next cyber Pearl Harbor. So there were many sensationalist articles, both in the literature and the media. Then in the 2010s, and especially the late 2010s, there were some more cautious articles saying that, okay, maybe we should be more careful, maybe we shouldn't emphasize too much the cyber aspect of conflicts, maybe cyber war hasn't arrived yet. So we saw this change in the literature, and at the same time, states started publishing their own cybersecurity strategies. So right now, both middle powers, major powers, and small powers have their own cybersecurity strategies, which focus on what I mentioned previously. So these state cybersecurity strategies talk about fighting cybercrime, protecting the critical infrastructure from cyber attacks. But for some states also talk about cyber defense, and the armies of these states have started incorporating the cyber element in their doctrines. So many armies have built their own cyber commands, which focus on conducting offensive cyber operations, for example, disabling electricity systems or disabling the electronic elements of an enemy army, and so on. So these were the developments during the last 20 years. On the one hand, academics started looking at the cyber element, and at the same time, states themselves started publishing cybersecurity strategies and started thinking about how to include the cyber element in their armies and in their fighting capabilities. Are these strategies similar? No. We see different conceptualizations of cybersecurity and cyber defense. For example, as I will mention later, Russia conceptualizes the cyber element in a much broader sense than other states in the so-called West. So instead of talking about cybersecurity, Russia talks about information security in the information space, which includes the elements of information manipulation, politics, the political aspects of information, and so on. So we see differences in how states understand cybersecurity and cyber defense. Right, so that gives me then the chance to talk a bit about Russia and Russian doctrines. I just mentioned that instead of cybersecurity, often Russian policymakers prefer to talk about the so-called information space and information security, which includes tactics and strategies about how to manipulate information through cyber means so as to achieve certain political results. In other words, since the 2010s and late 2000s, Russia has understood cybersecurity in a much broader sense than countries such as the UK or the US, where cybersecurity is viewed in a more technical way. Right, before talking now about the war in Ukraine, I want to give you a couple of examples about the situation before 2022. So how did states conduct cyber operations before 2022? One key event for many countries in the world was the 2007 cyber attacks against Estonia. Arguably, these attacks prompted the European Union, the United States, and other states to start thinking seriously about building cybersecurity strategies. So in 2007, there was, in the Estonian government decided to remove some of the monuments from the Soviet era. And this was opposed by Russia, and to coerce the Estonian government, there was a series of cyber attacks against this country, against Estonia. These attacks were linked to Russian actors, and we saw attacks such as distributed denial of service attacks, the crashing of websites such as newspapers, government portals, banks, financial systems, and so on. So for a couple of weeks, people could not use online banking. Some of the government websites were out of operation. And in the history of cyber conflict or cyber war, this is considered a watershed moment. During these years, we saw a couple of other tactics used, for example, changing the websites. For example, you could see a government website changed to include propaganda from an enemy state. This is a website defacement. We saw a couple of attacks, hacking and leaking of sensitive information. And of course, in the 2010s, we also saw this tactic of using both trolls and bots to spread disinformation. So these tactics are used for a couple of reasons and aims. For example, these tactics can be used to coerce a government, to coerce an enemy, but they can also be used as a preparation for an invasion, as a preparation for a war. and this is what happened in 2014 in Crimea and also in 2008 in Georgia. So in other words, these tactics can be used both at peacetime, but also during wartime and conflict. So let me give you some other examples. During the 2008 Russian-Georgian war, Russia used some of these tactics. For example, Georgians did not have access to several internet websites during the war. There was use of web defacement. Many government websites were hacked and changed, and we also saw the spread of disinformation, but also propaganda. 2008 was also during that time that Facebook and Twitter were very new, and it was at that time that this tactic of spreading propaganda and disinformation in social media made one of its first appearances. Cyber attacks were also used in Ukraine in 2014, but also between 2014 and 2022. We have a couple of examples. There was in 2015 a malware attack against electric distribution companies. In 2018, if I'm not mistaken, there was another attack against a water distribution company. And 2017, there was the famous NotPetya malware. So this was a malicious software that was hidden by Russian actors within a famous tax analysis Ukrainian software. So this NotPetya malware, what it did to your computer, essentially it was locking your computer. Essentially, you couldn't have access to your computer. Now, unfortunately, this malware spread outside Ukraine. So at least 60 countries around the world were affected. And I think this is a good example showing us how conflict or attacks in cyberspace can sometimes go out of control. And it's not always easy to control how these operations will play out. I have a personal example from this 2017 NotPetya malware. So in 2017, I had just arrived in the UK, in Britain, and I remember that the National Health Service system was also affected by this malware. So at that time, I think it was around May 2017, when I was visiting a local National Health Service office. And I remember seeing these posters saying, our electronic booking systems are out, so you need to book everything through paperwork and through paper forms. So I think this is a good example of the interdependency, of the cyber interdependency, if you want, of how things that happen in Ukraine can affect people all over the world. Right, let me now talk briefly about cyber capacity building in Ukraine. When we analyze the war in Ukraine right now in 2022, we often forget that Ukraine made a significant effort to build its conventional and cyber defenses between 2014 and 2022. So we often ignore this effort of Ukraine during the last 7 or 8 years to build its defenses. I have here a couple of examples. European Union had this program called EU for Digital Initiative, Cybersecurity East. So this was a program of capacity building for countries such as Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and Azerbaijan. In other words, the EU provided funding, and with this funding, these states implement a number of programs, including cybersecurity programs. The US Department of Energy and the US Department of Treasury were also present in Ukraine, trying to assist Ukraine in protecting its electronic financial systems and its electronic energy systems. More importantly, in December 2021, the US Cyber Command arrived in Ukraine and they started assisting Ukraine in identifying vulnerabilities in their networks. So they arrived in December 2021 and they left in February 2022 when the invasion started. The UK had also a presence there. So there were personnel from the UK Signals Intelligence Agency, the government communication headquarters, but also personnel from the National Cybersecurity Center staff. And finally, another key aspect in this conflict that we should remember is the involvement of the private sector. So, for example, Microsoft has provided at least $239 million on financial and technical assistance to Ukraine. And it also plays a role right now on sharing information about electronic and cyber vulnerabilities. So these two elements, I think, are important. Firstly, the element of capacity building, the element of alliances, but also this aspect of the private sector involvement. Right, let me talk now about the 2022 war and invasion. As we all know, the first tactic of Russia, or rather the expectation of Russia, was that the capital will fall swiftly, that the operation will be a special force operation, and it will finish this operation in a couple of days. So that was the expectation, and that's why during the first couple of weeks, we did not see any severe cyber attacks against the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. The reason is that Russia was expecting that Ukraine will fall swiftly, and that's why they wanted to keep this infrastructure working, because they will take control of it. Now, when this failed, so when this expectation did not play out in practice, then we start seeing more severe cyber attacks, and one of the most important ones, which was quite successful, was this attack against a satellite system used by government and security services. This attack happened both at the first stage of the war, but also later on. So during the first couple of hours of the war and the invasion, Russia managed to disable a government and army communication system for a couple of hours. Eventually, the communications were restored, but this was one of the key attacks. We saw in March and April several attacks against critical infrastructure. For example, there were attempts to disable electronically electricity systems, electric supply systems, gas supply systems, water supply systems. And there was also at the same time an attempt to infiltrate Ukrainian networks. in order to steal information and for espionage purposes. In April, Microsoft started giving a couple of reports about how Russia was preparing itself before the invasion with a series of cyber attacks against Ukrainian systems. And a key question that has emerged from this war is why we haven't seen a severe impact from cyber attacks. In other words, during the previous 8 to 10 years, people were saying we should prepare for a cyber conflict in Ukraine. When a war will start, the cyber element will be prominent. And the answer to this question is that actually there were severe cyber attacks against Ukraine, but Ukraine had built very successful defenses, and that's why the impact was not as strong as expected. So let me now conclude with giving a couple of observations about the role of cyber in conflicts and war, drawing on the example of Ukraine. First of all, we saw the importance of the private sector and the importance of individuals. I talked previously about Microsoft. We have also the example of Elon Musk with his Skylink satellite systems, which he provided at some point during the war. This is something that we often say during the last 10 or 20 years. War and conflict is not something that happens only between states, but now we see that the role of private sector is also important. And this is something stressed in the cybersecurity strategies of states as well. Another cyber element that we have seen in this war is the role of individuals. We saw thousands of individuals organizing themselves in volunteer online groups. For example, Ukraine's so-called IT army, the Network Battalion 65, and other online vigilante groups which organized hacking attempts, hacking attacks, web defacement operations, operations that were supposed to crush the enemy systems and so on. Now, do these groups have a significant impact? We cannot say that their impact is crucial, but it's an important element that we cannot exclude from our analysis. There is also this element of international assistance and cyber capacity building that I talked previously. So similarly with other aspects, similarly with conventional military assistance, similarly with economic assistance, we saw that in the cyber element, there is also this element of cyber of capacity building and international assistance. So alliance politics also play a role in the cyber domain. So one conclusion that you can make is that Ukraine had built quite strong defenses with the help of the international community, and that's why the impact of Russian cyber attacks was not as severe as Moscow would expect. Some general questions that we can reflect, and these are some questions for you to reflect as well, are the following. How about this famous Article 5 of NATO about collective security and mutual defense? Is this article applicable in cases where a NATO member state is a target of a state-sponsored cyber attack? And how about international law? Is it applicable in cyberspace. And there is already an emerging literature about both questions. Finally, before concluding, a bit of shameless self-promotion. I have written recently 2 papers on cybersecurity. One is an article about the EU-US cybersecurity relationship. It's open access if you want to take a look at the Journal of Cyber Policy. And finally, I have also written a book chapter on the EU's promotion of cybersecurity abroad. And if you want to take a look, please let me know. Thank you for listening to me. I'm looking forward now to hearing your questions, comments, or anything else that you would like me to add. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anagnostakis, for that fascinating talk. We have quite a few comments, people showing their appreciation really for your insightful talk. Let me start the discussion by using the power of the chair. I'll kickstart the discussion with a question. Now you talked about the interdependency here and the spillover effects of cybersecurity, that sometimes you have attacks in a single country that sort of spills over onto other countries, or sometimes indeed there are multiple countries are attacked at the same time. So there's this interdependent nature of the threat. But my question is in relation to the response. And I'm not sure, and this is the question, to what extent, let's start with the European Union, has a robust, unified policy on this, because this falls, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this falls within the remit of the domestic security or internal security, where states have traditionally been very protective. So I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on this a little, because sooner or later this may well indeed spill over from Ukraine onto the European Union. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question, and thanks to the audience for listening and for their comments as well. Yes, that's an excellent question, and indeed, the primary responsibility for responding to cyber attacks is at the member states, the EU member states right now. Now, what the EU is trying to do is trying to create common cyber standards for every single EU member state. So the EU says that, these are the cyber standards that you will follow, and then the way that you implement them within your state, it's up to you. Things changed in late 2000s. I mentioned the Estonia cyber attacks, which were a waking up call for the EU member states. So it was at that time that the EU published its first cybersecurity strategy. I think it was around 2010. So what the EU did is it created an EU-wide cybersecurity agency, which would collect information from member states about cyber attacks. So let's say that there is a cyber attack against Germany. Germany would inform the National Cybersecurity Authority, and then this German National Cybersecurity Authority would inform the EU Cybersecurity Authority. And then the EU Cybersecurity Authority would inform the rest of the member states. So there is an effort to create common responses and at least to create some awareness about cyber attacks. So there is this desire to respond swiftly. Now, the problem with that is this information sharing is voluntarily. So often national agencies are reluctant to share information about attacks because these attacks reveal weaknesses about their own national systems. So what happened in late 2010s is that the EU said, look, in the private sector at least, when there are severe disruptions in critical infrastructure, reporting should be compulsory. So for instance, if gas distribution service is severely disrupted, then as a company, it's compulsory for you to report that to the national authority. So that was something that the EU legislated with a directive that at least the major providers, the major infrastructure companies have this responsibility to share information. It's not perfect because some people were criticizing that, okay, what happens with attacks that are not that severe, and how do we find the severity anyway? So the EU at the moment is trying to build a more unified policy response. Member states are a bit reluctant. It's the game that we always see within EU politics.
Yes, absolutely. But if we sort of go back to Ukraine briefly, we've talked about you told us about the capacity building efforts there, and you've just also told us about what the EU's doing in sort of developing a more robust cyber security policy. The things I reckon get a bit tricky when we start moving into the domain of international law. And I want to ask you on that, what your thoughts on that, but from the practical perspective. Are we seeing defensive as well as offensive counter moves from Ukraine at the moment? Because we've been focusing on the Russian attacks. And you said that Russians, of course, have this doctrine which includes counter offensive moves as well. But are we seeing the same from Ukraine, or are Ukrainians more on the defense here? Before, of course, we talk about international law too.
Yes, thank you. Excellent question. So when we talk about offensive cyber operations, it matters how we define them. So there is one definition that focuses on disabling enemy systems, for example, or enemy critical infrastructure. That's one definition of offensive cyber operations, but some people would include in offensive cyber operations things like strategic communications, spreading propaganda in social media, and so on. Now, on the issue of Ukraine and its use of cyber operations, there was in June 2022 an interview by the head of the United States Cyber Command. And in that interview, the US Cyber Command leader had said that, yes, we have conducted offensive cyber operations against Russia and through Ukraine. And suddenly everyone was asking questions, okay, what do you mean? Is this a first? Is this a direct attack of US against Russia through cyber means? And the US Cyber Command did not elaborate. I suspect that it was also a conscious attempt to signal to Russia not to escalate. So it also served this purpose of public signaling. So what were these offensive operations in June? We don't know much, but we suspect that they might include this element of helping Ukraine to spread its narrative, its stories through social media. So in other words, in terms of offensive operation, the US has helped Ukraine in building strategic communications, spreading narratives through social media. Ukraine was very successful on that. Now, did the US help Ukraine on attacking Russian infrastructure? We don't know much at that point. My reasonable guess is that yes, there is an exchange of practices. Yes, there is an exchange of best practices that we don't know right now. I would add here that perhaps there is not so much use of offensive cyber operations from Ukraine at the moment, because we see actual acts of physical destruction taking place in Russia, actual acts of sabotage against recruitment centers. So I think we have already these acts at the moment. But at least in terms of defensive cyber operations, we know that Ukraine has fared very well. But yes, on the question of international law, there are many issues, many tricky issues. Okay, if there is a proxy war right now in Ukraine, a cyber proxy war where the US helps Ukraine and Iran helps Russia, is there a danger of this spiraling out of control? And for that reason, international law experts are trying to build confidence measures in cyberspace, like signaling, for example, that signaling intentions in cyberspace, talking about attribution of attacks, and so on.
And the attribution itself is quite a challenge, isn't it? We don't always know.
Exactly, yes. The attribution is very tricky, and that's why cyber attacks and the use of cyber attacks has been seen as a useful element for states.
Indeed. Now, let me see if there are any questions from the audience. Feel free, by the way, I'm talking to the audience, to share your thoughts and questions with us. Another question, Dimitrios. Of course, you've written an excellent book on EU-US cooperation, and I wonder what the repercussions of what's unraveling in Ukraine may be for this cooperation. Do you expect it to strengthen? We've of course seen NATO coming back on the scene. Well, depends who you ask, of course. For some people, it was always on the scene, but nonetheless, I think there's a lot more acknowledgement these days that NATO sits right at the heart of European defense. At least I think. So, what do you think this may hold, for the future of EU-US cooperation on cybersecurity?
Yes, excellent question. Just before I start, apologies for the reflection. I think the sun is coming from the window, which is something good for Aberdeen and the UK.
Indeed.
Right, NATO and EU-US relations. I really like this question because that's one of my so-called pet peeves of mine. So every couple of years, we see people declaring the end of NATO and the end of transatlantic alliance. We saw that in the 1990s, fall of the Soviet Union, NATO is dead. Then Iraq War, 2003, NATO is dead. The transatlantic alliance is dead. Brexit crisis and EU economic crisis, again, the EU is dead. Transatlantic alliance is dead. But my opinion is that NATO, the EU, and the transatlantic institutions are very robust. And it's not that easy for them to just disappear. There are political differences on a number of issues throughout the years, but despite these political differences, technical cooperation continues under the surface of any political differences. Now, in terms of NATO and the EU, I mean, the constant problem is about the so-called burden sharing issue, about EU and European countries in general, not just the EU, paying more for their defenses and sharing to the NATO budget. And the Ukraine war was, on the one hand, the perfect moment for NATO to start pushing its member states for paying a bit more for their national defense budgets. So historically, all EU and NATO institutions progress and evolve through crisis. So these crises, instead of destroying or dissolving the institutions, they actually make them a bit stronger. That's what we have seen. That's the politics or defense side of it. If we now count the economy aspect of it, many states around the world are in severe economic problems, recession. European budgets are not in a good shape. So we see these two forces. On the one hand, desire for paying more for defense, Ukraine war, but at the same time, we have the economic concerns. So ultimately, I think it will depend on domestic audiences' priorities. Often, domestic elections are shaped by economic concerns. And I suspect that many NATO governments will decide to postpone a bit the spending of more for defense.
No, well, you may indeed be right on that, because when we look at the forecasts with the shrinking economies, of course, you will know better. There's a cost of living crisis in the United Kingdom. There's a slowdown in China, which is affecting global markets. We may be safe in Europe this winter in relation to our gas supplies, but things may start biting a bit more come next year. So you are absolutely right in that sense. In this all uncertainty, defense budgets may indeed suffer. How do you justify an increase in defense when you have a shrinking GDP? Let me have a look. We have quite a few more messages of appreciation from the members of the audience, and in fact, we are also running short on time. So let me, on that note, thank our speaker once again, Dr. Dimitrios Anagnostakis, who was here with us this morning, joining us from Aberdeen in Britain in the United Kingdom. And Dr. Anagnostakis is one of the most prominent experts in the field on cybersecurity. And we discussed this morning the developments that have been unraveling in Ukraine in relation to cyber threats and what the future holds for cybersecurity policy in the EU, but also in relation to the transatlantic relations. So thank you, thanking my speaker once again, Dimitrios, a very good friend of mine as well, for joining us, and the members of the audience as well, those of you who are watching us right now, who have been watching us this morning. Now, please do follow the Institute's work on social media to stay informed and up to date on our upcoming events and publications. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
and we
thanks
look
a lot.
forward to seeing you again at another event. Thank you so much, Dimitrios.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Hayalperestlerin, risk alanların, denemekten korkmayanların cesaretinden doğduk. Bizi asla yarı yolda bırakmayan o sesin rehberliğiyle ilerlemeye ve öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Bunun için varız. Bu yüzden gece geç saatlere kadar lambalarımız sönmez. Elveda demek hem hüzün hem de gurur verir. Her şeyi sorgulayarak ve merakımızı besleyerek, dayanıklılığımızı test ederek, sınırlarımızı aşarak, ilerleyerek ve yeni ufuklar açarak yeni bir yol buluruz. Yeni icatlar çıkararak, kendi yolumuzu çizerek. Burası fikirlerin doğduğu ve yeni fikirleri doğurduğu, bizim de doğduğumuz, birlikte büyüdüğümüz ve yükseldiğimiz yer. Burası Yakın Doğu Üniversitesi.